Paul Polman, CEO of Unilever, thank you so much to agreeing for an interview for my book. How are you?
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you.
Look forward to it.
What role can businesses such as Unilever play in meeting the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals?
Well, there are many roles that business can play. In fact, I would argue that being part of the main driver of climate change itself and the way business is doing business, it also has to be a major part of the solution. We would not get to below the 2 degrees, or what many people now argue 1.5 degree scenario, if business is not there. There are the obvious things that business needs to do, which is obviously bring in new technology and innovation. The car would be a great example, the electric car, or the battery storage, or the new green technologies in solar. We see rapid improvements, and that's probably one of the bigger contributions business can make. We should not underestimate. But there is more that business can do there. If you really get into the whole issue of climate change, and you're actually talking a human development issue more than anything else. And I think business really at board level down should internalize that within their operations. So first they should be familiar with the science, and then they should develop their business strategies really around that. And businesses that do that tend to also be more successfully now from a financial or shareholder point of view. So internalizing it into your own business models, start to think about reducing, thinking about changing your energy mix. And we have found in Unilever enormous savings in these opportunities, but we've also found that anytime we invest in green energy, that we have a payout now that is 2 to 3 years maximum. So very confidently we've made a commitment to be carbon positive by 2030, and we've greened our manufacturing operations in Europe and the US already 100%. So that's encouraging, and I think business will all benefit from that. The third thing business can do is obviously be advocates and give governments courage. We're living at a time where it's very difficult for politicians to take the right decisions, and often they are short-term and driven by many different factors, and I think we can de-risk that process. When you saw about 2,000 businesses in Paris and again in Marrakesh, there were quite a lot of us there, and we come forward with these initiatives, often sectorial, that show that you can have a significant impact and still be very healthy in terms of economic growth and job creation. Politicians are probably willing to take a little bit more risk, and it would be fair to say there were many players in Paris, but certainly the outcome, although not enough, but the satisfactory first step outcome was probably also because of the pressure of the private sector.
Thank you, Paul. I wanted to ask you about a message that you would send to political leaders and governments, just following up on what you've just said. What do governments need to do to encourage companies like Unilever further in the direction you seek? And I suppose my question in part is informed by the imminence of President Trump's election, but also to all politicians, a message to them. What do governments need to do?
Right. Well, assuming for this question that the issue is well established, that we don't have to go through this, I think the big debate that we've been able to change a little bit is a lot of people at the political level were thinking about climate change as something separate, as a choice between job creation and economic growth, or tackling climate change. And what we are now starting to see, thanks to the work of the new climate economy and many others, is that if you don't tackle climate change, you don't have job creation or economic growth. So getting it out of the Ministry of Environment alone, which in many countries is a sub-ministry of another ministry, and bringing it actually into the Ministry of Finance and higher up on the political agenda is still very much needed. And we continuously see actors changing. So getting that message across is very important. The second thing is obviously then showing that it makes a lot of economic sense, that we can now actually green our society at relatively limited additional cost. And actually, if you take then the externalities into account, the IMF was talking about $5.3 billion, and I think the numbers keep going up, then you can see that it actually makes enormous economic sense. And not surprisingly, that acceleration is happening. But we still need the governments in many instances to help be at the table in terms of putting the right frameworks in place. There are many instances still in the world where you have perverse subsidies. The carbon subsidies are still 700 to 800 billion, although getting less. We really have to get out of that. We have to accelerate the conversion out of coal and find alternatives, making our financial markets work better, to be able to finance these alternatives, and the clearer governments can get their policies in place and the clearer they can set directions of where we want to go, the more we can unlock ultimately the funds of business to play a role. And it's not only just in the energy producing sector. We're talking here about deforestation or reforestation, which is obviously an incredibly important part. We're talking here of driving to sustainable procurement on some of our materials. We're talking about many of the different aspects, obviously, that affect our carbon footprint. And so understanding that, working that policy framework is very important. Recycling packaging material, moving to a circular economy, an enormous economic opportunity, but also attacking a carbon footprint. Reducing food waste, which is still 30-40% of the total, an enormous carbon footprint. Thinking about infrastructure and how we build cities, especially in the emerging markets. There are ways to do it and there are ways not to do it. And often if we do it the wrong way, we're stuck for the next decades or generations sometimes. So how do we build climate smart cities and build these regulations? And so putting a price on carbon might be one of the immediate steps, but if they don't go together with having the right policies in place, it doesn't mean anything either. So governments really should put the emphasis of their, first be aware, make it a policy beyond the environmental minister, and then work with the private sector and others, may I add, to put the right policy frameworks in place and financing mechanisms.
Thank you, Paul. I was wondering if you could give me one or two case studies. I mean, there are so many about where Unilever is doing something to address deforestation or to promote the circular economy or protect fresh water or encourage more sustainable agriculture.
Climate specifically, or
yes, climate and environment, but also fresh water, whichever two or three that you think.
Well, it depends a little bit. For us, we've made a business model that says we want to totally decouple our growth from environmental impact, and we want to improve our overall social impact. We express that by being sustainably sourced 100%, or creating another billion people having access to health and well-being. So we set audacious goals because of the size and scale of Unilever itself. So we think about things now differently. One of them would be our tea business with brands like PG Tips or Lipton or Brooks Bond. We happen to be one of the biggest tea manufacturers and in the world. So we've gone back into our tea plantations to be sure that we have sustainable tea, that we get source certified, because people increasingly want to know where it comes from, that these practices of soil management or pesticide management or water management or drought resistancy are at the highest levels. But as we build these tea plantations, we're also thinking about creating livelihoods, creating jobs in Africa, for example, where we have 3 expansions and 1 new tea plantation under active activity right now. We think about how can we create jobs for smallholder farmers, and once we get into these smallholder farmers, in this case a few 100,000 jobs and many more in terms of livelihoods, how can we then be ensured that it is fair wages, that these labor standards are met, that the housing situation of these people has the right sanitation, the clean cooking stoves and all the other things. So because you put a model out there that takes responsibility of a total value chain, you're actually getting into many other things. And then you find that some bottlenecks are there where you cannot make the economic model work based on current standards. You can lean in a little bit, but increasingly you have to forge these partnerships with DFID or USAID, or in this case with the Ian Wood Foundation as an NGO if you want to, and others, the Institute of Sustainable Trade, and bring these coalitions together to do something that is right for us long term, but also for the multiple stakeholders involved, especially these smallholder farmers. Another example obviously is palm oil, which you alluded to, and the enormous levels of deforestation. And it was Gandhi who said that what we do to the forests of this world is a mere reflection of what we do to ourselves and one another. And obviously you've often called them the lungs of this world, and yet we're losing them at a rapid rate. So everybody is concerned about that. So we've created this coalition with the Consumer Goods Forum and made a commitment collectively to go out of this deforestation by 2020. Unilever has already done that, but obviously we want the whole industry to go out. So you take on those responsibilities. Then you find out that you need to have common standards what is high carbon stock, what is deforestation. So we create networks with the Greenpeaces, the WWFs, and often other NGOs that are quite challenging in the private sector to put a framework in place. Then you create a broader coalition with governments and countries involved. In this case, let's say Indonesia, Norway, the World Bank, and create a tropical forest alliance or other things to move it forward with these multiple partners. And what you then see is you make progress fast enough, no, right direction, yes, but increasingly I think we're getting these things under control. And as a result, we find the certificate palm oil to be sustainable already in our case, but we're rapidly moving to source certification because I think that's the future. And again, you get into these issues of smallholder farmers, etc. You look at Indonesia, most of the forest fires now are with the smaller smallholders that frankly don't have the money to hire a machine and don't have the capabilities to clear the land and can take land that isn't properly registered. If you get that focus on the smallholder farmers and show that it can work, then the government is also more inclined to adjust their policies and enforcements and all the other things that come with it. So we set up a new fractionation unit in Sumatra, which you don't have to do. It would have been simpler for us to buy on the market, but we create our own fractionation unit, now have an infrastructure that is source certified with 25,000 smallholder farmers. So we look at a supply chain now quite differently than we otherwise would have done. So these might be two examples.
Thank you.
To make it come alive.
Very good examples. We in the environmental movement often say, we wish we had more Paul Polmans. How can the world encourage many more companies and many more CEOs to demonstrate the leadership that Unilever has shown and that you personally have demonstrated?
Well, I think increasingly we see this. I don't think the world needs more Paul Polman. It's already tough to deal with myself. and I always say talk to my wife first. But fortunately there are many of us. And increasingly people are seeing that things need to change. It's not that people before us were stupid or didn't have that knowledge. It's just that we have created so much wealth so quickly and lifted so many people out of poverty that these pressures on these planetary boundaries are now really visible. China, just a week ago, where people had to stay home in Shanghai or Beijing for pollution levels that were way beyond control. It's not surprising that they just announced a 320 billion green energy package additional package between now and 2020. So these pressures are there. These pressures are there from the marketplace, but these pressures are also there on our own business models. People increasingly are starting to understand that if we don't take action, the costs are going to be higher, and you already see that into your business models. The drought we had in Brazil and people stopped taking showers immediately affects you in the bottom line. Or the changing weather patterns immediately affect you in the bottom line. Often the business community sees quicker the negative effects of what is going on in volatility of input prices or in changes in market demands than politicians or anybody else sees. So it's not that difficult to rally business now. There's no business person who wants more air pollution or more people going to bed hungry or more youth unemployment. But the challenge is how do you rally people around them and enough people to make a change. Economic situation is tough, so just to keep your business afloat for many is not easy. Tenures of CEOs have become shorter and shorter. There's an enormous pressure from the financial market on the short term. So you have to change some of these boundaries. One of the boundaries is to what I call redefining value, is putting a price on these externalities. Normally when we put prices on these externalities, we tend to take better care of them. Getting out of the short term in the financial markets is another boundary that we need to change. And as you change these boundaries, you find that more and more of the private sector are willing to participate. But you look at the UN created for Paris this Nazca website where people could put their ideas on, and we had, I think it was about 4,000 companies now on there. We have now over 1,000 companies that have an internal price on carbon and science-based. You have initiatives like the RE100 or many of the others that are now coming up, like the low-carbon technology platforms that the World Business Council has put out there, the We Mean Business Coalition, and increasingly we see responsible business aligning around that. But again, we need to significantly step this up beyond a coalition of the winning to get really a critical mass to have impact. And that requires all of us. And there some work needs to be done, and the main investment we can really make in that is to create more leaders, in fact. In many of the issues that we face, we know what to do, we have the answers. Often the examples are already out there, but we need to scale them for impact. And increasingly we're looking at Unilever, how to use our size and scale, being in 7 out of 10 households globally, having 2 billion consumers using our products every day, to drive some of these more transformative changes. And that is where obviously we need leadership and willpower, which by the way is itself a renewable resource, so it's very attractive to us, and create a new type of leadership for tomorrow's world, which is a world more transparent, more partnership, and more purpose-driven perhaps than where we've come from, and hopefully we can, create enough of those leaders.
And Unilever is a company, I think, of 169,000 employees, and I wanted to ask you, how does it work in terms of inculcating this vision in across the company, across the world?
Well, we live in a very uncertain world where there's a lot of volatility. Some people call this the VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, and it sure is. And I always point out to people that what you see now is probably the beginning of a volatility that is what's going to be much higher. And you see it around you all the time with the complexity that we've created. So purpose-driven business models make even more sense. If you have your strong true north or your inner compass and you know where to go, you can get more people rallied behind that. Many of the decisions we have to take in countries where ultimately the bulk of the decisions are being taken, when you have a natural disaster like a hurricane we just had again in the Philippines, or a geopolitical conflict like, let's say, the Middle East, or many of the other things, you don't have a rule book because it would stifle you, but you have a purpose and people will make the right decisions based on that. So it tends to be very appealing and motivating to people who want to make a difference, who want to leave this world in a better place. So when we came up with this Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, instinctively people get it. And then the people that come in from the bottom, let's say the people we hire, basically the millennials, they are far more purpose driven. In fact, they will select companies on the basis of its purpose. We get 1.8 million people applying to us every year, and in most countries that we operate, we are the preferred employer. And when we ask why that is the case, it's really because of our Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. The third most looked up company on LinkedIn after Google and Apple is very hard to explain to anybody. But I think it helps you to attract the right people, build your reputation, and then you get this pull from the top. You need to be sure that the CEO is fully behind it, that there are clear commitments being made publicly as well, that they are being measured, and then you get this push from the bottom. And where the pressure often is that you cannot boil the ocean at once. Eat the elephant with one bite. You have to have a plan that is a multiple year plan, where you can, sometimes make decisions a little bit better on this side, a little bit less on the other side, but where you move forward, and where you create the capabilities for people to deliver on that, and the space for people to do that. And there are always pressure points, and we're trying to be very mindful on that to be sure that they get translated into positive energy. One of the reasons we stopped quarterly reporting and stopped giving guidance is to exactly provide that space, that people were not putting themselves under too many constraints of quarterly reporting, and that has been a key liberator for us. But we treat the investments in sustainability and the future of mankind to the same extent as we treat investments in our people and development, or investments in IT systems, and that needs to get you out of the quarterly mindset.
Thank you, Paul. I recall in 2015 that you met the Pope, a number of leaders did, and I wondered what role you felt. I think you're the son of a vicar, potentially, is that right?
No, not really. I studied for priest.
Oh, you studied to be a priest, I'm so sorry. The story had transformed.
No, you don't have to be sorry for that.
What's the role of the faiths in this global sustainability?
You might be sorry that I didn't pursue it.
It's Theresa May that's the daughter of a vicar.
No, I'm actually happy that we grew up in a Christian or religious family, and it certainly has helped me find my purpose in life. And I think the Pope, and it could be in any religion, but the Pope has clearly shown that the influence of an individual can have in terms of changing things. And in this case, he's changed the face of the Catholic Church. He's taken some courageous decisions, and and has an enormous influence on a lot of people. And when he came out with his clear statements around the importance of climate change, he understood very well that this was a human development agenda that especially affected the poor in this world. And any system where too many people feel that they are not participating or they feel they're being excluded ultimately rebels against itself. We've obviously seen that for a long time in the emerging markets, but we see it increasingly also in these parts of the world. And I think the Pope, with his reach and to his influence, is an important part of helping change the climate agenda. We clearly saw in the US at the time of, go back to September 2015, that the opinions of the US were being changed, not only amongst Catholics, but also amongst the broader group of the population. And I think it helped cement this deal that we now see in Paris. There's no question about it. And the Pope has been, I think, fairly good in embracing the other religions as well, and do this with a lot of faith leaders together.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you a question about growth and the circular economy and the tensions that exist in the effort that you are leading. Because on the one hand, there's a drive for growth, but on the other, there's also a drastic need to reduce waste.
Absolutely.
And how do you reconcile these two competing?
Well, I don't think they have to be competing.
Right.
I understand they are competing, and we don't need to dwell on that. People understand that part of it. But for example, when I came into Unilever, it was very much a volume-driven company. What tonnage of detergents do we sell? How many liters of fabric softeners do we sell? But if that becomes your measure, then you're driven by the wrong incentives. You would never go to concentrated detergents, for example, or concentrated fabric softeners. So you need to change the measures, and I think we're a little bit in this case as well in the world. We measure the world's GDP in a very narrow definition of producing more stuff, and we actually forget a lot of things that would improve a person's well-being. I think it's time for us to really look at that and provide a little bit more, a broader framework to measure what economic growth looks like. It's now clear that with Ubers or car sharing or Airbnb's hotel sharing, we're going to build less hotels, but people are more comfortable and have a happier life. They don't need to buy the car, they get dropped off in front. It's probably at significantly lower cost, but our economy measures that as a decline. We have now more access to music than at any time in history, and are actually using it. But we've moved from the big discs to the smaller CDs, and now to completely online, if you want to, with the Spotifys of this world. But we are registering that as a declining GDP. So we need to start, I think, changing a little bit more. And in fact, when GDP was invented, the person who invented that made it very clear that it should never be used as an ultimate measure of economic success. Now, I believe that you can continue to feed the people in this world, make more people's lives better, provide for the other 2 to 3 billion people that might still come to this world, if we also think about how we do things differently. And this brings you to the circular economy. We've created this linear production model of digging in the earth, producing something, and then dumping it on landfills and the oceans. Now, we've done that so long already that soon the landfills will probably be the most precious pieces of land on earth. It's a good investment, in my opinion. And the oceans in 20, 30 years will find themselves with more plastic than fish. So that's not a sustainable model, and I think we're starting to understand that. And the technologies are there, the knowledge is now there, the transparency is there to go to think about redesigning the way we produce things, so that someone's waste might be someone else's input, that actually nothing goes to waste, just like in nature nothing goes to waste. And that is what is called the circular economy. And I think there are some examples starting to come out there that are actually encouraging. We have now designed all of our factories in the world, and this is probably the first company of this size and magnitude, of zero waste to landfill. People said it's impossible. We actually did it 2 years ahead of what we thought it was possible. And it's just a matter of thinking about that. In our households, the people that are a little bit conscious about this will be able to have zero waste and recycle everything and these type of things. So thinking about things differently, I think, will allow us to do a lot more in economic growth and a lot more in inclusion, which might mean more things, but in a way that then obviously doesn't put more pressure on the planetary boundaries. One of the main reasons that why we have made this commitment to go to 100% sustainable sourcing, for that same reason.
Thank you, Paul. My last couple of questions, if you would.
Yeah.
One is about young people in developing countries, in agrarian economies in particular,
Yeah.
and what a company like Unilever can do to help inclusive growth, support local farmers so that the models of farming themselves are sustainable over time, keep young people involved in the rural economy when there is a viable rural economy.
Absolutely. So it's very clear that we need to focus on the young. In Africa, probably you will have in 30 years' time half of the world's young population. In fact, half the population right now in the emerging markets is below 25 years old. So the issue of the young and inclusion of them in our economic process is going to has to be very high on everybody's agenda. Otherwise, you'll see far more social tension, and increasingly that is true globally as well. In the Brexit vote and in the US vote, you saw clearly that the young generation was taking a different position than the ultimate outcome. And that's probably one of the first indicators of this tension that is there between the generations. We try to do a lot, especially in the emerging markets that you refer to, very early on already. A child that is born, you have to work on child mortality, which is one of the Sustainable Development Goals. And whilst it has come down, we still have a lot to do. So we work a lot with our bar soaps and our hygiene products on child mortality with the different organizations, UNICEF being one of them, Save the Children the other. Then when the child is born, it has to get the right amount of nutrition in its first 1,000 days. We call that stunting. 160 million children are stunted every year. In some of the sub-Sahara economies, 10 to 15% of their GDP. So can we provide the right nutrition? So we reinforce our bouillon, for example, with iron and all the other things. Then you get to a child having to reach the age of 5. We still have 3 million children a year that die of infectious diseases like diarrhea and pneumonia before the age of 5. It's not your or my child, but it happens to be a lot of other people's children. So we have brands like Lifebuoy and hand washing habit changes that we try to reach 1 billion people, especially in these markets, to get rid of these infectious diseases. Then you need to get to schools, and you get into schooling programs where women will probably be discriminated and not have access to schools. So we build toilets for these schools. We ensure that we have women empowerment programs. We advocate for same rights in all of these countries and are very active on that, as we are on the same rights for LGBTs and other things. Then in the school itself, you might have a brand like Dove doing a women's self-esteem program where we reach 100 million children now, especially women, and give them the confidence to be part and be who they are, and so forth and so forth. And now what we are looking at obviously is in our value chain, be sure that we have a gender lens, that everything we do, that we create jobs for women as much as for men. It's probably one of the biggest economic possibilities to unlock. If women would have the same land rights or access to financing or education as men, the global economy could be higher, up to $28 trillion more. It's probably one of the biggest opportunities we have. So we take this gender lens in everything we do, and then we take this job creation lens. Especially in Africa, if we cannot create an economy there where people can function themselves and feed themselves and participate in the workforce, then it puts pressure on the rest of the world beyond even what we see today with the issues of refugees and everything. So we're very mindful of that, and that is one of the reasons why we've made a commitment to create 5 million jobs among smallholder farmers, and we're about halfway to that. It's an enormous effort, it's not easy, and I tremendously respect all of the people that we work with and the people in our company to make that work, but it's the only way to do it, in my opinion. And you see, if you can do that, that you then also create communities that make these economies better. And then you have to go beyond that. You have to work on many of the other issues that, for example, at the government level, one of the bigger killers of global economies is corruption and not having access to legal systems and non-functioning governments. So we spend a lot of time on being sure that companies pay their tax in the countries that they operate, that capabilities are being built, that transparency is there of ownership and all the other things, so that the environment is created where young people can have a chance and where they can be themselves. And then you get into the whole value chain of labor. There are still 150 million children in forced labor in the world, so you get into things like the Ruggie framework and of human rights, and how can you work on rights and skills and opportunities that put these people in schools and not in our value chains or in any value chain. So the issues have become quite complex, as you can see, and quite multi-dimensional, and that's probably why it also requires a different leadership to do this, and it's certainly a different role for companies, a different social compact. The average length of a publicly traded company has gone down from 65 years in the 60s to about 17 years now, and I think the reason that publicly traded companies have such a short life is that they are looking too much after themselves and their shareholders and not after society, and we need to bring that purpose back, that the only reason we are here is actually to serve society, and in doing that well, our shareholders will benefit, but it really puts the onus again on where we need to be. And that requires a different social contract, and we need to feel comfortable about that. It brings risks with it, it brings exposures, it attracts cynics and critics and all the other things that come with it. But we're at a point now that if we don't collectively do this and work for the common good and make these changes, who is going to do that?
Thank you, Paul. And in my last question, I wanted to ask you what your plans are in the immediate future. I know there's a Commission on Business and the SDGs that you established is about to be launched, but also to ask you, in light of all that you know and all that you're doing, without wishing to ask a trite question, are you optimistic that we can turn this around and put the world onto a fundamentally better path? What keeps you up awake at night? What inspires you? How do you see this playing out in the next 10 or 15 years?
Well, I was recently with Desmond Tutu, and he was asked, are you optimistic or pessimistic? And I take the liberty of giving his answer, and he said, it's not neither optimistic or pessimistic, I'm a prisoner of hope. I think when it comes to climate change, when it comes to the SDGs and Human Development Agenda, I'm a prisoner of hope. I think that would be the best thing. Anytime you have a negative thought or try to be cynical or don't believe in it, it doesn't lead to anything. I think we do have the opportunity, and I proudly wear the Sustainable Development Goal pin for the next 15 years. I think we do have an opportunity in the next 15 years to irreversibly eradicate poverty in a more sustainable and equitable way. And I also think we do have the possibilities to do something on climate change so that future generations don't have to deal with it anymore. That alone is very, very motivating to me. I think with Paris we gave a clear signal that we are going to decarbonize this economy. We've seen a rapid acceleration of things happening after Paris. The divestiture movement has really picked up, and so the financial market is becoming aware of these $35 trillion of stranded assets on books of companies that we will never use. You see companies getting actively involved with prices of carbon. You see governments nearly competing with each other to move the ceiling higher. You see technology rapidly evolving. So I'm very optimistic, but the speed is obviously what we need to focus on. And every day that we lose, there is someone in the world that is suffering. There's still 8 million people that die prematurely in this world because of air pollution alone. So if you don't believe in global warming or not, and you still belong to those 5%, I do think that you believe in air pollution or in deforestation, or in food waste, whilst 800 million people still go to bed hungry. And my request to those people is just detect the symptoms then, and solve those, and you'll actually help us make a major contribution also to climate change. And the same is for the development agenda. We have so many success stories where people have been lifted out of poverty. The Millennial Development Goals in the first 15 years had as goal to halve the number of people living in poverty, at that time defined as $1.25 a day. We've actually achieved that. Why not go the full way now and make this an inclusive society for everybody? The huge opportunity of the Sustainable Development Goals, which require an investment of about $2 to $3 trillion a year, relatively little on a $100 trillion global economy, and can give a return that is 4 or 5 times higher, if not more. Some people have estimated that the minimum return could be 12 trillion in the next 15 years alone if we do this properly. So at a time that money has no cost, at a time that we need to look at economic growth and job creation. We're actually sitting here with the Sustainable Development Goals that have been approved by 193 countries that actually give us the answer and probably provide the biggest economic opportunity that we've seen in mankind ever. So I'm fairly optimistic about that, and one of the reasons then that we created this commission is it's easier to make people aware of climate change, which is one very focused area. In fact, goal 13 of the Sustainable Development Goals deals with that, but it actually permeates all the other 16 goals as well. There's 17 goals in total, but it's more complex to understand 17 goals and how that can how you can run your business around that and why it's so important. So we've created the Commission on Business and Sustainable Development under the tremendous leadership of Mark Malloch-Brown, and the Commission is about to publish a report which will get a wide reading on the enormous opportunities that are there, but also responsibilities. I always remind business of Viktor Frankl's book Man's Search for Meaning, that when they built the Statue of Liberty on the east coast of the United States, they forgot to build the Statue of Responsibility on the west coast. And what we're trying to do here with the SDGs is to say to businesses, take that responsibility, because it guarantees that you don't fall into the statistics of only having a 17-year life, but you also create this enormous opportunity for your businesses to be successful for a long time to come. At the same time, making this a more inclusive and sustainable world, and that ought to be very motivating, I hope, to the majority of people. As far as we are concerned ourselves, we have an obligation there, because I think unfortunately we still only belong to the 2% of the world population that sort of is educated, that can move around freely, is financially independent to some extent, and then it's really our duty to put ourselves to the service of the other 98%. Now if we do this and keep focused on this common good, I have no doubt in my mind that we can create this better planet for all and truly get to the definition of sustainability that was well laid down in the Brundtland report. But I've always simplified it by simply saying that the best definition for me is if the future of your children and their grandchildren is more important to you than your own personal greed. So if we can overcome that challenge and put ourselves to the service of others, I'm very optimistic for the world that we live in.
Paul, thank you so much. That's very inspiring. I'll resist the temptation to ask whether, if President Trump invited you to say all of that to him in the next 20 days, you would accept his invitation. But
oh, I definitely would, and we're actually actively working now with the administration. You're
Great.
dealing here with a president elect that says many things that obviously, like we've seen in Brexit, turn out to be lies. So people are accustomed to politicians talking things that don't mean anything anymore. Newspapers now have the lowest level of trust. People just don't believe any of that anymore. So I think we're here in a period that we have to judge the man by what he does, not by what he says. And the economic forces overwhelmingly speak for doing the right things here, also on climate change. Many of the US companies, the tech companies, etc., have already moved to a 100% green model. Coal is economically not viable compared to shale gas and some other, increasingly some other forms of energy already. So I think the economic force story needs to be told forcefully, more so than a climate change morale story. But at the end of the day, we're after the results, and I think there are many possibilities to get some good results. And as you have seen, China is stepping it up and really creating that competitive advantage, and I'm sure that the US doesn't want to miss that opportunity.
Surely.
That's what we're hoping for.
Indeed so. Well, thank you so much, Paul, and thank you for your leadership and your inspiration.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And all the best for
Thanks,
the future.
I appreciate that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.